Hello guys, this is Talha Imam, and today I'm going to talk about the Lighthouse Speedtest page, which is quite famous nowadays, and it gives us a brief overview of how our site is doing according to the recent core vitals metrics of Google. And what are core vitals? They are one of the factors through which Google is ranking websites, is going to rank websites from May 2021. That's right, May 2021 is the date when the core vitals speed test will be, put to practice. Actually, when it will be live, and Google will start, ranking sites based on this factor, and among other factors, obviously. So this video is just for giving a brief overview on how to read this report actually, and how to explain it briefly to your clients or someone who does not have a lot of knowledge about technical stuff. So for instance, first, when we enter our site or the related site here to analyze, we see two tabs, the mobile tab and desktop tab. So obviously the Lighthouse speed test is running differently for the desktop side and the mobile side. So Google wants to make sure that the site looks great on every platform, whether it be mobile, desktop, or even tablets, which is not included right here. So you can see mostly websites are doing fine on the desktop, but this time, most of the users nowadays are coming on sites via mobile. So Google literally wants to make sure that our site, is doing great with mobile. So these are the two sections, and I'm just going to talk about the mobile section in this video because most of the things are overlapping in both the tabs, and mobile tab has more items in it. So first, about this bar, what these ranges mean. Google wants our sites to lie in here, somewhere between 90 to 100, and that is the only portion, that is the only range which Google is satisfied with. The 50 to 89 range is something where Google wants us to work even more. 50 to 89 range means that we need to make more improvements to our site. And if our site is between the ranges of 0 to 49, then Google is saying that your website is just doing very poorly on mobile. And as you can see, the site I'm using for this tutorial is doing very poorly on mobile. So yeah, so I'm just going to talk briefly about this section, what it means. The first contentful paint means the first thing which a user would see when they enter our website on the browser. The first content, the first thing which loads on the site is the first contentful pane. For example, for this PageSpeed Insights page, this is the first contentful pane because this is the area of the site which we see before scrolling the site. So before the user does anything to the site, the first thing which user sees on the site is the first contentful paint, obviously. And the speed index is the overall speed index of the site, on how fast, on how much time the site is taking to load when the loading bar on the browser stops. So that is the speed index, and that is standing at 15.5 seconds, which means when a user enters the URL mobile, it takes 15.5 seconds to load this website completely. All the request response cycle is completed in 15.5 seconds, which is terrible. All right, and the largest contentful paint means that the largest area of the site, which is the largest content area of the site, and how much time does it take to load. For example, for this site, this is the largest contentful paint, all right? Because this is the main area of the site and which contains the most information and which is the largest content area. So it is called the largest contentful paint, and this is the time it is taking to load, all right? So this is the summary for these three keywords. And the time to interactive means how much time after the user enters the site, in the URL box, and how much time does it take for the user to be able to interact with the site. So this site is standing at 14.5 seconds. That means when a user enters the site through mobile device, and they cannot interact with the site for 14.5 seconds, and that is huge. The users would literally change the site or close the site if this is the amount of time which a site is going to let the users interact with it. So the total blocking time, this is a purely technical thing, and this pertains to the JavaScript loading time, obviously. And obviously the site blocks the user from doing anything or loading the content or rendering the content or doing anything on the site. The blocking occurs due to the JavaScript code and how it is rendered on the site. How much time it is getting to, parsing the JavaScript and rendering it onto the user's screen. So the blocking time refers to the JavaScript. It is directly proportional to the JavaScript execution time. So this is standing at 2600 milliseconds. It's terrible too. And this one is another core waytel. It is cumulative layout shift. This pertains to a website making layout changes as the user is going through it. For example, when a user enters the URL of the site, when the site loads haphazardly, for example, this portion loads, this thing loads here at first, but when the site is completely loaded, it moves here. And this thing was here and it moves here. So this thing, when the structure of the site is not correctly in place and the content loads and shifts the layout of the page, this is called as cumulative layout shift. And this is standing at a whopping 1.055 right now. All right. And here the Lighthouse Speedtest is telling us that values estimated here may vary. Obviously it varies. Sometimes this site gives me a score of 7 when I'm testing it on a low traffic period, etc. So obviously it differs, but all in all 3 and 7 both are poor. So they need to improve, obviously. Here are the snapshots of the site, and Google is telling us that this is how your website loads on mobile. And at first user sees nothing. This is what it means here. The wide screen is shown to the user as the website loads. All right. And here is the opportunities section. This is a very good section. It actually tells us so what are the things we can improve on our site right away. All right. So the first thing here is reduce initial server response time. It corresponds directly to our hosting. Where we are hosting our site and how quickly the site is being served from the hosting, and how good is the CPU on the hosting, and how quickly are they managing request and response cycle, the HTTP request and response cycle, etc. So these are all the things which correspond to the server response time. And here the Lighthouse Speedtest is telling us to reduce the server response time, which is a whopping 4 seconds, about 4 seconds right now. So yeah. And then they're telling us to eliminate render blocking resources. So first, I'm just going to tell quickly what render blocking resources are. They are obviously CSS and JavaScript. The CSS files and the JavaScript files are render blocking resources. So Google Lighthouse Speedtest is telling us to eliminate them. And we can just eliminate them by putting them in footer or removing the unused JavaScript and CSS, and placing them in separate chunks, load critical CSS first and load the rest of the CSS later, same with the JavaScript files, etc. So just Google is just telling us to eliminate the resources which are blocking the rendering of the site. All right, and here the the Google Lighthouse test is telling us to preload key request. This preload key requests is nothing. It is purely technical, and the Google is telling us to add a preload attribute to the link tags on our site. Whenever there is a critical resource that is detrimental to the loading of the site, Google is telling us to preload it. All right, and then Google is blatantly telling us to remove unused JavaScript, because the Lighthouse test is detecting a lot of JavaScript code which is not being used on the page, but it is there. It gets loaded. So this is highly unrecommended. So Google is telling us to do the same for both CSS and JavaScript, as to remove them. All right. Then there are further diagnostics about the performance of our application. All right. And these diagnostics do not directly affect the performance score, but they are a factor. They're a factor in calculating the overall performance score. Eventually, they do affect the performance score, not directly, but they do. So they are saying that ensure text remains visible during web font load. This is also another thing Google is telling us to make sure that the web fonts, if we are using any fancy fonts on our site, we just need to make sure that those fonts are loaded using the font display property, and the font display property should be set to swap, so to make sure that the normal fonts are loaded before the fancy fonts are loaded, so user sees the content even before the web fonts are loaded. All right, and here the Google is telling us to reduce the impact of third-party code. Third-party code is all the code on our site which is not being loaded from our server. That means the code which we are referencing from other sites, for example, from Google or from jQuery, from Mozilla, from anywhere, from any other site. So third-party code usually needs to be, we generally need to make sure that the third-party code is deferred and it is placed on the bottom of our site, and it's not and it does not block the rendering. So this is one thing. The Google is telling us to not use passive listeners. The scrolling performance. This is the scrolling. So the Google is telling us to not use passive listeners. This corresponds to JavaScript code, and Google is telling us to make sure that our JavaScript is set to not use passive listeners in order to improve the scrolling. The scrolling thing can be improved by not using passive listeners. So this can be set in JavaScript code. All right. And here Google is telling us to minimize our main thread work. So what is the main thread? Main thread is the execution area of our site where all the major work, the important work is done. For example, the HTML parsing is done, the CSS rendering is done, the JavaScript rendering is done. All right. So the Google is telling us that the main thread right now is doing a lot of work, and that is mostly because there is a lot of CSS that is not used but there, and the web browser rendering engine still has to go through that unused JavaScript and CSS, and all in all, the main thread has to do a lot of work. So we need to make sure that the main thread is not working a lot. JavaScript execution time, there is no, JavaScript is a fast language, but when Google is telling you to reduce JavaScript execution time, they're usually telling you to make sure that the unused JavaScript is not there, and the JavaScript is served in chunks, so to make sure that each chunk is executed quickly. For example, if there are 100 lines of JavaScript code, obviously they'll take more time to execute than 20 lines of JavaScript code. So Google is actually telling you to order the JavaScript files and the code on your site very smartly, to make sure the JavaScript rendering engine does not keep engaged, does not stay blocked for a long period of time. After that, the Google is telling us to avoid the excessive DOM size. DOM is the document object model, which is the core model all sites using HTML. HTML has a DOM, HTML tag when it opens and when it closes. Between all that, a DOM is created. So if you're using a lot of HTML elements, a lot of CSS, a lot of JavaScript here, it means that HTML is also used a lot. So there are 1,114 HTML elements being used on this page. So Google is just telling us to avoid using so many HTML elements because, and there must be a way to make sure that less HTML can be written and more can be gained. Especially since HTML5, many things are, can be done with lesser HTML tags, less HTML tags, I mean. All right, so here the Google is telling us to avoid chaining critical requests. Okay. So they're telling us to make sure that all the code on your side is, is not changed. The critical request means the JavaScript requests which are needed to be rendered for the first contentful pane, for loading the content up with the fold. Those are the critical requests, So Google is telling us to avoid chaining those requests with other requests, to make sure load them separately, in order to load them faster. Google is telling us to keep request counts lower and transfer size small. This is Google's way of telling us to make sure that our file sizes are small. The images sizes are small, the CSS file size is small, the JavaScript file size is small, to make sure the request and response cycle are not very large, and the number of requests should be reduced too. All right. So this is what Google means by this point. And the largest contentful paint element, should be simplified when Google is telling us to, telling us where the largest contentful paint element lies. It is telling us to make sure that the contentful paint element, it is light in size. Avoiding large layout shifts is the same thing which I explained initially in the video. The cumulative layout shift is dependent on this. If our layout shifts as the content is loading on our page, it is not a good sign. It is not a good thing for Google. So we got to make sure that we are not shifting our layout a lot with the loading of the content. And the main thread should not be busy. The main thread, as I just explained during this point, minimize main thread work, that the main thread needs to be unblocked. It needs to stay unblocked to make sure the site stays on the loading path, and it does not block the user from waiting to interact with the site, etc. So the main thread should go unblocking. All right. So whatever stuff we need to do, we need to do in an asynchronous manner. All right. So this is the Lighthouse report. Most of the points I did cover in this video, and if there are any more questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And make sure that you leave a comment and subscribe. And I'll be posting more videos about the core vitals thing and how to specifically take care of these points. So stay in touch and do subscribe. Thank you.